Okay guys, so we are going to go over some of the major joint motions with my model here, Sully Cove, I think we are calling him. And so just to go over some of the major motions of the joints, and so we can have a little bit more of an interactive here while we're, many alligators away from each other. I definitely want to look at the sort of non-specific aspect of emotion. So for example, okay, just going through in the order that your manual discusses this, right? So we can talk about flexion, a flexion. For example, we can talk about flexion of the knee. So when we're talking about a flexion of the knee, we're bringing in the leg toward the thigh. And so we can be not necessarily so specific about that. We don't necessarily talk about a full knee flexion. So if we bring him through a full knee flexion to about 140 degrees, right, it's still a flexion if we bring him through a flexion of, say, 30 degrees, okay? So flexion of the knee is what it is, okay? And so let's go through a lot of these non-specific movements. So he's starting out in a modified anatomical position, right? So with his thumbs out, okay? Want to make sure that the radius is on the more lateral side, all right? And so just looking overall at abduction. So with abduction, we are bringing a part of the body away from the midline. So in the shoulder, abduction is going out away from the midline. Okay, adduction would be the opposite movement, coming in toward the midline. Okay, so a abduction, a deduction. Basic movements in the manual. So with flexion, you have the closing of a joint angle, and it primarily occurs in the sagittal plane. So here's a shoulder flexion to 90 degrees, and then an extension that occurs as we open the angle of the shoulder and are still moving sagittally. Okay, so we have talked a little bit about abduction, adduction, flexion, and extension of the shoulder. The shoulder, because it has the 3 degrees of freedom, allows for circumduction. So in circumduction, this conical pathway is made by the shoulder, and so we have a combination here of adduction, flexion, abduction, extension that is occurring in that movement, okay? And then we also have some diagonal movements that we talked about through the diagonal plane. So we talked about abduction of the shoulder diagonally and adduction, okay? And so the shoulder is capable of abduction and adduction, okay? Other movements that we talked about today, we talked a little bit about rotation. So rotation externally and internally, limited on Sully here. So if we flex his elbow just a little bit and we also rotate, we can see external and internal rotation occurring at the shoulder, and we'll definitely be coming back to those movements. Okay, so rotational movements. So for the ankle, we have eversion and inversion, okay? These are movements that are triplanar, and we'll discuss exactly how they work and the joints that are involved, okay? And then we also have dorsal flexion or dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, which are specifically the talocrural joint, and we'll talk a little bit about this region in more detail. But for now, those movements. We also, when we're dealing with both the wrist and foot, we'll talk about pronation and supination. And so when we're dealing with the foot, he also has an ability to pronate and supinate. A limited ability, albeit. But And so, you know, other movements that we talked about a little bit with the scapulothoracic girdle, okay, are elevation and depression. Elevation and depression. Okay, protraction, he's not very capable of, so in protraction, we are bringing forward the shoulder girdle, okay, and in retraction, the scapulae are coming toward each other, okay, and so they are adducting. Okay, great, so some other movements that he can't make that well just because, you know, he's joining us. It's good enough to have him sort of sitting here right now, but we can, the scapulae can also rotate slightly downward, and so the inferior angles will move in together. So that's downward rotation, and then we have upward rotation, where the inferior angles are moving laterally and up, okay? All right, guys, so just to wrap up here with a few more movements from the manual, we have in the shoulder, adduction, horizontal adduction, and horizontal abduction, okay? You can see this model can do a lot more abduction before the elbow starts to chime in, okay? And horizontal abduction. So scaption and movement in the scapular plane, we talked about, follows that line of the scapula as the arm moves. So the shoulder will be moving in line with the angle of the scapula. Okay, so we tend to do a lot of exercises in the scapular plane, and we'll talk about that with some aspects of programming. Lateral flexion or side bending, not possible in this model. And reduction is that return. So I have lateral flexion and then reduction. Palmar flexion refers to moving the volar surface of the hand toward the forearm. And then dorsiflexion is an extension movement, or that dorsal flexion of the hand occurs, okay? So we have palmar flexion and dorsiflexion. Then we also have ulnar deviation and radial deviation. In your manual, they also use the term radial flexion and ulnar flexion. So this would be ulnar flexion, and this would be radial flexion. Okay, so those are movements of the wrist. And then finally we have opposition of the thumb, so that you know, the thumb crosses the hand to make contact with the fingers and then repositions itself when it comes back to neutral. So you have opposition and reposition. All right, we're coming in for the selfie here. So we'll see you next time for Chapter 2 of Kinesiology.